Greetings, curious acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to our archives. The lightsaber is the sacred bread and butter of the Jedi Knight, particularly though in times of war. Though they try to resolve things diplomatically, a Jedi doesn't always have peace as an option. Sometime or later, the time comes for every warrior on the light side to brandish their signature blade, and when they do, they best know how to use it. The 7 classical forms of lightsaber combat each have their own way of supplying the Jedi with tools that they need in order to resolve any conflict, though each individual forms have their strengths and their weaknesses, which become far more emphasized during these times of open war, such is the case with the Clone Wars specifically. The Clone Wars plunged the Jedi into a galaxy-wide conflict, the likes of which the Order had not seen for nearly 1,000 years. In this day and age, it quickly became apparent which lightsaber forms were going to be more suited for the battlefield over others. And in this holocron, my friends and acolytes, we are going to cover which lightsaber forms were made popular and which forms practically went extinct among Jedi during the Clone War. So, which of the lightsaber forms used by the Jedi proved to be particularly useful and saved many lives, and which forms got many Jedi killed? Starting off, we'll be talking about the forms that basically died out among the practitioners in the Order once the soldiers hit the battlefield and blaster bolts went flying. The first is actually going to be Form 2, Makashi. The elegant duelist form made popular by Count Dooku is very underappreciated among the Jedi. Unfortunately for Makashi lovers though, this underappreciation isn't entirely unfounded, and if one used this form during the Clone Wars, they likely may have been killed. Form 2 was created during a time when the Jedi needed a solution for blade-to-blade lightsaber combat against the Dark Jedi and Sith of their era. However, times did not remain such as this, and the Sith gradually became less and less of a frequent problem, and because of this, the dual-oriented form also petered out. Sad to say, but by the time of the Clone Wars, Makashi was a dying form as things stood. In fact, it was so uncommon that it sometimes worried the Jedi Council whenever a student desired to specialize in the form, such is the case with a young Dooku. Form 2 focused on a linear path of movement, measured and precise blade strokes, as well as balance. It focused entirely on single combat and defeating another lightsaber wielder as quickly and efficiently as possible. Because of the very nature of the parries, strikes, and thrusts of the user's blade, this form found itself very weak against blaster fire. This isn't to say that a Makashi practitioner couldn't survive a firefight though, as we've seen Dooku do this plenty of times. Specifically though, this form was not suited for such engagements, and was primarily geared towards melee combat one-on-one. Again, unfortunately, Makashi was very weak against multiple opponents, though a true master of Form 2 knew how to divide and conquer when faced against many foes. This took exceptional skill and training, however, with this being one of the reasons why Dooku himself even surrendered against the like of Hondo Ohnaka and the rest of his pirate gang. At the time, Dooku had double the disadvantage. He was completely surrounded by multiple enemies, and they were all wielding blasters. You can now see why Makashi was ultimately rejected by any lasting practitioner once the Clone Wars began. On the open battlefield, it wasn't likely you were able to get close enough to a target or close the distance quickly enough to make full use out of Form 2. Plus, rarely anyone was using anything but blasters in those days. However, Dooku found continued use in his preferred form once he was forced to fight against his Jedi brethren and completely destroy them. Also, Dooku wasn't a military leader, so he wasn't in open combat hardly at all. It likely would have been on his own terms, thus giving his Makashi the advantage. But anyway, let's move on to another. The second dying lightsaber form was that of Form 6 Naiman. Not many people seem to know much about the Naiman form at all, and that is because this style never really garnered an identity of its own. While Shi-Cho was known as being the basic form, and Jem-So was an aggressive form, Naiman was only ever given the title of the Diplomat's form. An appropriate title nonetheless, as Naiman symbolized everything that one might think a Jedi should be. What Form 6 was, is basically taking influence from each of the other previous 5 forms and combine them into one. This created a sort of jack-of-all-trades form that carried no significant weaknesses, but also no significant strengths either. Naiman was a form practiced mostly by Jedi consulars and Jedi diplomats, as the form was essentially made for those that do not like lightsaber combat but still need to know how to use the weapon, and still needed to be a competent Jedi. It was used by those who might find themselves in a variety of situations, and need a form that will suit them wherever they may be. While the form sounds pretty ideal, like a Swiss Army knife kind of form for Jedi Guardians adventuring out during the Clone Wars, in practice, it wasn't all it cracked up to be. Form 6 users found themselves overwhelmed by conditions of the battlefield, explosions going off, laser bolts flying everywhere, not to mention a heavy amount of one kind of opponent with hardly any change or shift. 9-man was a form that was suited to mold to any task that the user needed it to. However, the reason it could do so was because of how simplistic the motions were, which offered hardly any real advantage against anything. We get an idea of how this form works in the Darth Bane novels, where a Jedi named Johan Othone uses the form as the bodyguard for the Supreme Chancellor. When we see him using his lightsaber, it's a bit underwhelming, as he barely managed to fend off a group of terrorists and actually loses a duel to a non-force sensitive. He only managed to win by pulling off a suicidal maneuver and grabbing the man and plunging them both into the watery depths. A maneuver that did not actually kill him though. When it was time for the Jedi to face an actual Sith though, he was cut down irreverently by Darth Zana, Bane's apprentice, despite the fact that she was using Sarisu, the entirely defensive form, with Sarisu actually leading us neatly into our next point. So what were the forms that actually flourished during the days of the Clone War, and battlefield forms that were perfect? Well, you've heard one, and that would be Master Kenobi's special, Form 3 Sarisu. After the embarrassing amount of losses that the Jedi suffered during the Battle of Geonosis, which was the first battle ever waged in the Clone Wars, it served as the first indication that the old ways of Jedi combat was basically obsolete. 2/3 of the Jedi fighting force sent to Geonosis died in the ensuing arena battle because many of them charged in without having faced an open battle opponent with so many gun-wielding foes. Some of their blast deflection skills were just not up to par, with the sheer number of battle droids present there especially, or the accurate shots of Jango Fett in Coleman Trevor's case. So, what were the Jedi to do? In comes the form that was created specifically to counter blaster-wielding foes. Sarisu saw its creation and rise during the early days of the Republic, when blaster technology became far more widespread. This form was pretty much all defense, focusing on creating a shield with one's lightsaber and conserving as much energy as possible. It was a form that relied on perseverance and peace, challenging the Jedi to outlast their opponents and wait for the opportune moment for their opponent to slip up and give them an opening. Many complained that the form's focus on total defense cost too much time and just prolonged engagements, which was when the more aggressive forms were created. But during the Clone Wars, Sarisu saw an absolute boom in necessity and a total resurgence. The orbital motions of the blade created a perfect barrier that allowed the practitioners the ability to block attacks from multiple opponents, as well as deflecting blaster fire from pretty much all sides of their bodies. Obi-Wan Kenobi became so proficient with the form that it was said that he could basically walk through a battlefield swarmed with blaster fire completely unscathed. Many Jedi who didn't specialize in Sarisu at least implemented its sequences into their regular chosen forms. We see Ahsoka Tano doing this in the Battle of Felucia, orbiting her lightsabers to deflect the blaster fire while standing atop an AT-TE in plain view of the enemy, yet being completely unbothered by the blasters. The fact that Ahsoka here, a Padawan at the time, was able to showcase this with ease and practicality of Form 3 proved its efficiency in combat, a form generally and previously looked down upon by most Jedi. There's a lot more to say about it, but we want to move on to the next form which was highly useful during the Clone Wars. That was Form 4 Ataru. This may come to a shock as some, as Ataru notably has the same weaknesses that Makashi does, that being that it is weak against blaster fire and multiple opponents. However, despite this, Ataru saw a massive surge in popularity at the beginning of the Clone Wars. Form 4 had always been a hot one to pick, especially among the Padawans because of its flashy acrobatics and the aggressive nature of the form. But many knights began to turn their heads to the way of the Hawkbat once they realized its true potential. Ataru is not great in tight spaces, but flourishes in open areas. On the battlefield, the movement options that Ataru offered made up for its lack of blaster defense, as the Jedi that used Form 4 opted to just dodge blaster fire instead of trying to actively deflect it. Many Jedi Guardians and warriors used Ataru to quickly swoop into battle and then retreat like assassins in the night. This easily began turning the tide once these Form 4 practitioners figured out how to take cheeky flank routines to divide the enemy back line. The perfect example of this is of course Grandmaster Yoda, who managed to obliterate a squadron of droids and a couple of tanks by simply moving around and slashing at specific spots. when Utaru-trained Jedi leapt into battle. Their intentions were to cause as much chaos for the enemy as possible, so as to create a hole for a follow-up clone trooper assault. Many times, this strategy worked perfectly, securing many Republic victories. But anyway, my friends and acolytes, I hope you enjoyed this holocron, and now you see why these forms were so popular, and why others went nearly extinct. We would really truly love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Also, if you like this sort of video and want to hear more on the lightsaber forms and other fighting styles, let us know down below. And until next time, my friends, may the Force be with you, and I hope to see you soon.